All right, hey everybody. Welcome to another episode of interviews with designers who are using AI in their current practice. Today I'm joined by Barron Webster, who has been involved in a lot of cool projects with AI. I think all the way back to the Teachable Machine, which is like a classic. Feels weird to say it's a classic, even though it's probably like what 5 years old now. But yeah, so I'm really excited to have him here. And again, this is part of my UX UI AI series, a course around teaching UX UI designers like about sort of the new paradigm of AI tools and how they can sort of leverage these tools, but also like leverage their general experiences and skills as UI designers to really make these tools even better. So with that, we'll get started. So Barron, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here.
Yeah, can you just give us a brief rundown of maybe your career and maybe some of the like trajectory of things for you?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been at Replit, which is a startup that builds programming tools for the last like 2.5 years. And before that, I was at a team at Google on the Creative Lab, um, focused primarily on bringing research to the market. And that's really where I kind of, I think, cut my teeth in AI design and designing for AI experiences. Before that, I was kind of hopping around a couple different places. I interned at Google and YouTube and at a design firm in Amsterdam and studied graphic design before that. Um, so kind of very traditional art school design backgrounds, bookmaking, typography, etc. Some of which I occasionally miss, um, but have been, I would say, primarily working on tools that are heavily related to AI since 2017, which is when, as you mentioned, kind of the first version of Teachable Machine came out. And ever since then, it's been fascinating to kind of watch the development of products like over the past, I guess, 6 years, um, as the entire kind of consumer and B2B industry is kind of catching up to like what's possible, and the research makes its way into the world. So that's a kind of high level summary. At Replit, my day to day is not always directly related to AI, but since I've been there, we've built an AI team of, I think we've got like 6 now, engineers and researchers. Um, and so it's kind of more and more a part of the kind of standard product process to consider how a given feature or domain kind of uses AI and brings stuff to users.
Cool. It's such a fascinating career, and I definitely want to touch on a couple of these things. I also wanted to highlight thing I saw that you had designed the cover for this book.
Oh my God, yeah.
Which is very
Yeah,
funny. I saw that and I was like, oh wait, that's sitting on my shelf. But for anyone who hasn't read this book, it's really good. Definitely like a great if you're interested in technology and culture, like that's a good one. But yeah, so I think you did that while you were at Metahaven. Is that right?
yeah,
Yeah,
that was probably 7 or 8 years ago.
yeah. It's been a while now. I know that book. I haven't read it in a while, but it's probably like woefully out of date now. But also like at the time when I read it, I was like, oh, this is really fascinating and definitely like new world sort of thing, like paradigm stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is the challenge with like tech, technology writing, especially the kind of academic and theory side is like the book is the measure of success, but the book is always going to be like dated in less than 6 months.
Yeah. And especially with publishing cycles where it takes a year or two to even put out a book, it's like by the time it
Yeah,
hits the shelves, it might already be out of date. I mean, I've been rereading a lot of like Lev Manovich's work as well recently. And it's like he's sort of moving back into the AI world, but like has done a lot of discussion. And yeah, you read some of his books and it's like you can see like he was on the right path for certain things, but then like obviously the technology is so out of date. Talking about Flash or whatever it is. And it's like, yeah, no one talks about that in that context anymore.
yeah, yeah. But as soon as you kind of like talk in the abstract, you just sound so academic. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
you know,
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge with a lot of these tooling, and especially like getting into AI. It's like, um, you know, when I started and you probably as well, it's like a lot of what you had to do was read a research paper and you're like, what the hell is this? Like, uh, very structured, very like, written in a way for other researchers. And you're like, well, wait, how do I use this thing? And thankfully, then we started to get code samples and we could actually play with GitHub stuff. And now I feel like the world is vastly different, in terms of like being able to start up and make some images or make some text using various tools. You can just find a ton of tutorials on YouTube, which is amazing.
For sure. Yeah, yeah, and also like the just the effort over the past decade that like the open source community has
Yeah.
put into the ability to like actually make the stuff run.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. Like, you mentioned you being at Creative Lab and sort of that was where you first got like sort of started to cut your teeth on AI tools. But like, I mean, was that actually the first place you saw machine learning or AI in person, or were there experiences before that?
Yeah, that was the first time that I'd actually like kind of worked directly with the material. When I was at school, I think I had a professor, Chris Novello, who's great. And when I was in his class, I think I was either a sophomore or a junior. That was, I think, right around when like the ImageNet paper started to get really popular,
Mhm.
and like RNNs. The timeline is probably going to be blurry, but
Yeah, it's totally fine.
that's basically when like you like it was feasible to do image recognition
Yep.
um, with machine learning, and so at that time, most of the like product experiences were like Instagram, Snapchat, Google Images, and then just like a ton of these kind of more technical demos. And uh, at RISD, there wasn't really a kind of computation focus. Like there wasn't really a focus on computation. Um, I think in the decade since, there's been a lot more work in like what it means to be an artist and a designer and use computation directly as a medium. But back then, it was like that was a pretty new thing for the students, at least. And so all of my time at RISD was kind of spent like in awareness of what these technologies were doing and kind of speculating about them, but I didn't actually get to like work with them hands on until 2017.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of the timeline where we start to see things become more popular, but like definitely again, I think we were just talking about this, like there were no product experiences for these things. It was like you had to read a research paper, you had to maybe find some code, and it was running on God, I don't even remember what stacks those were running on at that time. But really like really difficult to even get that running on a machine. So when you got to Google, like how I mean, one, people might be interested to sort of learn how Creative Lab even works, but like were you sort of handed this project and said like, hey, we need to figure this out? Was it like a collaborative effort? Like what was sort of the process of that?
Yeah, so I guess the first part, how Creative Lab works, like the short of it is it's just like a kind of a loose confederation of teams
Hmm.
that are I would say like their primary characteristic is that they don't ladder up to like one particular uh, product or marketing vertical. And what that means is that they kind of cover or like fill in the cracks where the traditional org structure um, makes things very difficult. And so some kind of more marketing examples of that are like redoing the whole brand for the company. Like as you can imagine, like if you're a brand manager on like Google Maps, and your coworkers are like brand managers on like Google Search or Photos, like there's going to be very little incentive to, and like a lot of infighting
Yeah.
to like make something cohesive that runs across the whole company. And so there was like this benefit for this team to be isolated from the kind of traditional org structure. Um, and that also played out kind of on the technology side in that it was a place to work with researchers and kind of understand the technologies that were coming out of different groups inside of Google without the pressure to force it into like one product, um, or force it into like one kind of marketing vertical. And what that meant is that like there was a lot more leeway to do kind of creative things that we thought were the most compelling way to bring something to market, whether or not they were like landing in a Google market or in a Google product with like a revenue stream behind them. Um, like one of the things that a team did while I was there that I didn't work on was the AlphaGo documentary. It was like a feature-length documentary about the first um, machine learning program to beat like a world champion Go player, um, which like most product and marketing teams are not going to touch.
Yeah.
Like, because there's just so much like there's so much risk there, and it's also like a huge project. But because you have this kind of uh, isolation, you can be more experimental. And so the way that most of the early AI projects that I worked on there came about were less, here's an assignment, like figure it out, and more, uh, we're talking to these different research groups, like just organically. And at some point, something kind of piques our interest when brainstorming or talking to them. And we um, figure out like what the most compelling way to bring that to market is. With Teachable Machine, it was it came out of a lot of discussions with the TensorFlow group. Like TensorFlow, I think was released in 2015, and in I think late 2016 or early 2017, Nikhil and Daniel on the TensorFlow team figured out a way to run inference in JavaScript on the web. And so what that meant is that you could, for the first time, like um, kind of run these lightweight training and inference jobs in the browser, and you didn't have to download anything from GitHub. You didn't have to like have custom hardware or learn Python or any of this stuff. And when we first kind of started talking to them, there were like a couple hundred different ideas of like what we could do with it. And Teachable Machine kind of came out of it like almost because it was a fun way for us to understand the technology internally. Like we wanted a tool internally that just let us simply play with it. And then as we were kind of brainstorming and playing with it, we kind of realized that it could be more interesting publicly to release like an open kind of creative tool than to release something like a demo. Because I think that was kind of the way we had traditionally thought is like the most compelling demonstration of new technology is usually like a sharp demo, like with a very kind of narrow focus. And I think at that time, we just figured it was more interesting to kind of let people play with it and feel out the technology directly because they finally could, instead of showing them like a cool demo that they could only watch through YouTube.
Cool. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and can you talk a little bit, I mean, for anyone that hasn't used Teachable Machine, because if you come to AI 2 years ago, this year, like you may not even know what Teachable Machine is. Can you explain a little bit about what it was and like, what its purpose was?
Yeah, I can. I think I could probably demo it if it. Let me see if the original one's still online.
Yeah.
But the short of it is that it's a web-based kind of tool to let you train your own image classification models.
Mhm.
And so the very first version in 2017 was extremely narrow. Um, oh, okay, I did find it. I don't know if I'm allowed to present on Zoom.
Find out.
But uh, no, I don't think I have permission. Oh no, there we go. Yep, green button. God, I'm
Nice.
so used to Google Meet. uh, um, so we built this tool that very simply allowed you to connect to your webcam and train three different classifiers on the images that are streaming in. And the output is like also extremely naive. It's like it either shows a GIF or it plays a sound, depending on like what classification the live camera came up with. So, like for example, here I could give it a couple of examples of me just like panning around. I could give a couple of image examples of my hand in the image, and I'll do the last one with this mug. And what's really fun is as soon as you stop training, um, the entire model is running live locally on your machine. And so like if I uh, hold my hand up, you can see the confidence for class 2 goes really high. If I put the mug in, it should trigger class 3. And the thing that was really exciting and fun to see people play around with is like you could start to see them build their own mental models of, sorry if my audio just interrupted, I just got a call, but you could see them start to like try to build mental models of where the systems break down, and how the kind of fuzziness works. So like one thing people would often do is like they would intuitively make classes with different objects and then try to see what happens if they put both of them in. And so like you can kind of see here, like you can feel uh, almost the edges of like where the model is getting confused between these two classes. Um, and I think that moment, that kind of like learning moment and experimentation directly with the model as it's running is the thing that really stuck with people. That was the thing that stuck with us when we like first saw the TensorFlow JS demos. And as soon as we released it, it was kind of off to the races. Like teachers found it really useful. Um, People like repurposed it in really weird ways. Like we open sourced the code and we would see like performers occasionally fork it and use it. Like artists use it for like live installations. And eventually we released like a much kind of more capable version of it. This is very much like a toy. Um, but the version we worked on in, I think, 2019 or 2020, um, it wasn't limited to just 3 classes. You could add like an arbitrary number of classes and you could train on images and sound data and like pose data. And I still think like there's a world in which that product just like kept growing. Um, but this is also an interesting callback to like the way Creative Lab works is like it's really not built to run products over a long period of time and grow them. The benefit and the drawback of that structure is like it's very good at 0 to 1 projects. But most of the 1 projects that came out of the Creative Lab that succeeded then ended up kind of being adopted or built into other teams, um, which is great. It's like it's super cool as a model, but it does mean that like if you have something that you think has more potential, it's it's going to be tricky to like fight for time and money.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is one, I think you highlighted. There's a couple of things I love about this conversation, which is one is I think we see this quite often with AI tools, which is like people try to break them, right? Like, I think with ChatGPT, we're seeing a lot of people trying to jailbreak it to do things it's not supposed to do, and people will generally will spend a lot of effort to try to break your tools. And if you really want to, in the AI safety world, if you really want to think about that, you really need to like overthink it in many ways. But I love the idea that like people are kind of using this tool to try to break it, but also like to your point, like try to understand the edges of a thing. And that's really fascinating. And, I'd also say like to this, like, I think you're calling it a toy, but I also see like this feels like a better UI and a better experience than a lot of the tools we have today. Like there actually aren't a lot of things that even are at that level today, um, that give you that sort of instant response and being able to play with it and learn from a thing immediately. And I think that that's something that's like definitely still worth considering as designers. Like how do we try to build that into every tool we're making?
Yeah, there is there are like a very narrow set of I think like well crafted experiences around like AI creative tooling. Around the time that we launched the second Teachable machine, Mike Mattis, who was like one of the original um, designers, I think at Facebook, and I think early at iOS, like designed the camera app. He released a startup called Lobe that like
Yep.
also did um, like they created a nice interface for training classification models. Um, and I was very excited about that. And then it got bought by Microsoft, and I haven't seen anything since then.
Classic
Uh,
Mike Mattis problem, but yeah.
yeah,
um, No, but I think like the other thing I think really is really interesting here is also that you're using classifiers, which I think like in the AI world feel like sort of a solved problem today. But what I think is so fascinating is how you can use a classifier to do so much more after the classification happens, right? So like, yeah, people are turning these into sound, live sound tools, or, using it to create live installation work. And I think like that is a missed opportunity today in a lot of the tools that we build, because it's so much about what is the newest thing, right? So it's like, oh, text to image, or chat GPT. Like, so much of the AI world jumps to the newest thing, rather than sort of being like, well, what if we sat back and actually like built, to your point, like a really great version of Teachable Machine, or a great version of these sort of classification systems. And it's sort of, again, it's like a lost art of some of these things, where even this thing being 7 years old is like kind of getting
Yeah,
lost to the sands of time in some ways.
for sure. Yeah. One thing I think is interesting about like the advent of products after the transformer, um, is that a lot of them, I mean, obviously like the most popular consumer products are um, more output based than like input based.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's fundamentally like in my head, a difference between like the transformer and the classifier is I think the classifier um, as like an architecture is interesting because it lets people uh, have more control over like the inputs into the system, and to get more granularity over like what's going into a system that they might be interacting with. Whereas obviously transformers are like you give it something and it spits something out the other end. Um, and so I do think there's a lot more room in kind of consumer product to build experiences that let you take control of either transformers or whatever architecture makes sense to you as a way of augmenting your kind of creation and like your ability to manipulate a system instead of um, basically like a slot machine,
Yeah.
which is the transformer.
Yeah.
And I think there are companies I think that are doing this. I mean, like Runway,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like their entire company is based on like video tooling. And the thing that comes out the other end, like, isn't necessarily just something that's been generated by AI, but all of the tooling there is like helping you manipulate the system of like a video file. And I think about those as kind of categorically different than like Midjourney, um, or like the other kind of image generation tools.
Yeah, that's a really great way of describing it. I think that slot machine aspect is like the thing where the first time you try the tool, you're like, whoa, this is really cool. But then the 10th time you try the thing, you're like, Jesus Christ, can I get a little bit more control here? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with this space is it's easy to wow people in that first demo, but it's really challenging to make a product that I think people can return to and feel like they have control over. And I think that's really like a company like Runway is trying to do that, right? Like I think they tried a lot of different things, and they sort of have like found that like, oh, video works for us, and like there's a clear market here. And to your point, it's not just purely generation, like that slot machine gets something cool out every 10 times, but it is more like we'll work with your video, like generate things on top of it, or allow you to tweak it in certain ways using the latest and greatest tools. So yeah, it's a really interesting space to be in right now, where I think in some ways is actually kind of a bad space to be in, because everyone's just aping chat
Yeah,
GPT. But in the other way, like if you actually do come up with a fundamentally different way of building a thing, or a different experience, I think you can really like leverage that and make your experience very different and ownable in that regard. And I think that's where a company like Runway, who I know have like been operating for over 5 years now. I can't remember the last when Chris started the company, but like they went through a lot of iterations to try to find the right product fit for them. And I think they finally have found it, and it's now building up, again, that sort of moat where like only they can really do these tools, because everyone else is starting from too far behind to try to get there. So it's an interesting space to be in, but it is a bit of a challenge for a lot of people, I think.
yeah, for sure. The thing that also reminds me is like I think what is less clear nowadays, like especially post ChatGPT, is like, and I think we'll probably discover this as an industry over the next like maybe 5 to 10 years. I think it's become really unclear like what the kind of like moat is for these kind of software businesses, and B, like what the go-to-market motion should look like.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think um, up until ChatGPT, I think the advice that like I would give So like my students and people working on product is like this the hardest thing to do and the worst idea is to like try to build something general
Yep.
from the start, right? Like find a very specific use case, be really good at that, so that you can clearly tell a story about what you do and you can expand from there. And ChatGPT kind of like threw that out the window. Like and so I think that it's kind of unclear now, like if you're kind of trying to build a product, like how general you should be. And the other thing that's I think very ambiguous is like, is the moat, and maybe this is like some weird inverse relationship between the two, but like, is the moat for all of these products really the model or is it the interface?
Hmm.
Um,
That's a great point. And it's also like, to me, it's also like the customer segment or what you know about your customers, right? Like I would almost make the argument that it's still a good idea to think sort of hyper focused and build a tool for a unique customer base, in part because you can't, most companies will never be open AI, right? Most companies will never have the budget or whatever or the talent to build a whole generalizable model, but you might be able to carve out a niche for video customers or for marketing customers and like focus on either fine tuning a model specifically for that user group or finding the interface or the tooling that customer base needs. So yeah, it's kind of funny. It's like I do think like, OpenAI has made it clear that like, oh, you can do generalizable stuff, you can do multimodal now, but who can actually pull that off that isn't Google, Facebook, or OpenAI is the bigger challenge, I think, where we are right now.
yeah, yeah. The thing that I think is like um, probably like a very promising direction that I feel like I don't see a ton of, and maybe they're just happening kind of quietly, but like I do think there's a ton of value in just having a very well designed interface for like a narrow domain where you can plug in newer models as they come online, right? Like if you're building, I don't know, an audio app for electronic musicians, like probably most of the value is going to be in like the interface design and like how well it integrates with Ableton and like all of these other tools that they're using. It's probably not going to be the fact that you're using like one newer version of a model. Um, but then I can also think of scenarios where like that's, the model is like a step change in capability and like it's this just funny, weird chicken and egg problem.
No, totally. And
uh,
I think it's, yeah, and I think
yeah,
it is, I think I also look at like the image generation space and how you've got Firefly, you've got Midjourney, you've got Dolly, and each of them are also like kind of leveraging their models, but also kind of leveraging different types of interfaces, right? So the Midjourney is sort of like Discord, which like for a lot of people, Discord is not the way they want to use a tool, but for that user group, it made a lot of sense. Whereas then you've got Firefly, where like the image generation might be a little bit different looking, but like it's Adobe, so like people are used to that. It's like, again, it's almost like they own a customer segment rather than, you know, owning the model or like having
yeah,
the best model or whatever it is. So it's fascinating to sort of see how, again, from a purely product standpoint, things are still breaking out in a way that like traditional product does. And they're just using the models as a lever within that space.
yeah. The interesting thing that makes me think of is maybe it's like a relationship between, um, how general you want to be and how like commodifiable you
Yep.
are, right? Like if you're going general, maybe this isn't true. Maybe we'll see that this is not the case, but it might be the case that the more general you are, the easier it is to switch you out with like a newer tool,
Yep.
right? As opposed to if you're building like the inroads and integrations in a very particular market, um, and you have like B2B buyers and contracts, it's going to be harder to, do the surgery and switch you out.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because it's just playing out like traditional product software is, right? It's like, yeah, like different strokes for different companies. I also think about like, are you really solving customer problems, right? Like if you just go back to like very basic product design, which is like what customer problem are you solving? And if you solve it better than someone else, whether that's through models or through interfaces or through pricing, like then you can like, like sort of execute on that continuously, right? Like I think a lot of companies right now are kind of like, oh, should we be investing in AI? And it's like, well, what customer problem are you solving? Can you not solve it currently with the tools you have, and you need to solve it in a different way with new tooling? Like then yeah, maybe you do need to. Whereas some people are just like, we're a B2B, like we just we've got a good infrastructure that allows customers to do X, Y, and Z, and like AI isn't there yet for us. And maybe it should be more in the R&D lab kind of space where you are trying stuff, but it's not ready for prime time yet. So yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm sure you get asked quite often about like, oh, should we be doing a chat GPT tool within our thing or whatever? And it's sort of like, well, maybe what are you trying to do? Like, it's more
Yeah,
about like what you're trying to achieve than just like, should we be building this tool?
for sure. Yeah, one of the interesting things about like the evolution of the AI experience on Replit has been um, like almost us kind of learning all these lessons like firsthand.
Yeah.
Um, in that like our our first couple of features were like autocomplete, which is like basically the same as Copilot, and like a chat feature in which you can like you can ask the chatbot in your project like, hey, how do I do this? And it'll tell you. Um, and what we kind of observed is like people would still just have ChatGPT open on one tab and like Replit open on the other. And we'd be like, oh, like how come you're not using the Replit AI, version? It's like the same thing, but it has more context over your project. And a lot of people just like either didn't know it existed, which is like a discoverability problem, which is just like classic product design,
Yeah.
or they trusted ChatGPT more, um, which is like, I think that's to me another really interesting question for like how to think about AI products is um, I still don't know if these products, like if the trust is transferable across the category
Mm-hmm.
or not. Like when I think about other categories, like I think that's been an interesting question for how defensible they are as a business. Like, for example, you know, 20 years ago, no one trusted or no one would want to go stay in a stranger's house. No one would like get in a cab that was driven by a random stranger
Yeah.
like in their
Yeah,
car.
totally.
Um, and I'm sure there are like a lot of, no one wanted to buy things on the internet. Like that was like an untrustworthy thing. You didn't want to talk to strangers on the internet. Like there are all sorts of cases where you have this like one or a handful of services that come along and like basically earn the trust for a given category. Um, like Uber maybe earned it for ride sharing, Airbnb earned it for um, I don't know what you call that, guest booking. Uh, and I think in some of those categories, like once one company earns the trust, then consumers kind of treat them interchangeably, right? Like if I trust Uber and like I've experienced the kind of positive like experience, like I'm gonna go try Lyft if it's cheaper. Like the trust isn't a moat there. Versus like I really wouldn't do that with Airbnb. Like it's not like Craigslist, like staying on strangers' couches on Craigslist is like suddenly like an equivalent market because Airbnb broke the trust barrier. And like I don't know whether like these AI products are similar, right? Because a lot of them will require, I mean, with Replit, even like uh, it's like personal projects, it's code. That's kind of like personal, like you might not trust everyone with that. And the more these products spread, like the more of your own personal well-being is going to depend on them. I think the higher that trust bar is going to be. And I think that's going to be a question that also gets answered in the next decade is like once once the category of trust is earned, like how transferable is that? Or do people just like not want to switch from ChatGPT to Bard because like they trust ChatGPT more, not because it's like a better product?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, there's trust issues. There's, just sort of basic behavioral of like, I've used this a bunch and I know it works. But I think, again, to your slot machine metaphor, it's like if you lose $1,000 on your first slot machine, you might be like, that one's cursed. I'm not coming, and I'm never coming
Yeah.
back to that one, right? I think that's one of the other challenges I want to emphasize for people is like, hey, if you don't have a good experience your first time, there are many, many, many other competitors that will try to do a slightly better version and people will go to that one. So it's like, as everyone rushes to build their own version of Chat GPT, it's a little bit of like, hey, do you really want to rush it? Like, if this is about trust or about like that first experience being good for them, like then maybe you really want to like spend a little bit of extra time to actually develop it a little bit more. And again, maybe it's not a model thing, maybe it's an interface thing, right? And it's like think through like, what you think is going to keep your customer there versus, any other one. I think, yeah, it's very fascinating to see what trust or what people think about these tools. It's like because a lot of the general public has very different ideas about how these models work, whatever it is, partly due to the hype and PR machines of various things. But it's like, oh, well, OpenAI is smarter versus, this one is not as smart. And it's like, well, smartness has nothing to do with it, but that's sort of the metaphor that they use or whatever it is. And I think that again gets to this generalizable idea, right? Well, if ChatGPT can write poetry for me, surely it can also then do code. Whereas if you have a machine that just does code, it's like a little bit of like, well, wait, is it better at code because it specializes in it, or is it worse at it because it doesn't have all this other knowledge as
Yeah.
a part of it? I think that's such a fascinating problem and not one that you experience in other product design systems because there's no like metaphor of knowledge in those cases. And it's such a fascinating and big challenge to overcome because it's not based in science. It's based in like an emotional sort of feeling of about these tools.
Yeah. Yeah. One like very odd corollary that I've been thinking about recently is like it's almost it's not this isn't equivalent, but it's almost like hiring in some way,
Mm-hmm.
in that like depending on the role you're hiring for, like you might be looking for someone with deep technical expertise and not care about like other skills. And for other roles, you're going to want someone who's like a generalist and not so deep. And I think like every hiring manager there is going to have a different philosophy as well. And yeah, there is like this funny like world in which you have all these models that are like basically applying to your company or like
Yeah.
applying to different like roles in some way, right? Depending on the job they're supposed to do.
It
Um,
also makes me think a little bit about like, yeah, you might get the right answer from these models, but did they say, hey, like, thank you or whatever? Like, did they speak to you in a conversational way? And is that like, or did they speak to you in a cold way and how people respond to that? Like, it's fascinating to watch ChatGPT and sort of like, as much as I dislike some of their interface choices, they built a version that feels somewhat more human, quote unquote. And I think that's on purpose to make people feel like, oh, I can trust this thing or whatever it is. And as someone who knows a lot about these tools, I'm like, I don't really care about that. Like,
yeah,
I know that's a fake. I know that's a fake sort of product decision. But I do think on some people it makes them feel like, oh, it's pausing to figure out an answer. It's like, no, it's not. It's just like they built that pause in. But it works. There is a sort of behavioral side of these tools that I think are fascinating to see being built. That it is almost like, do I want to grab a beer with this AI? Like that's sort of how people are deciding if this thing is right for them or not.
yeah, yeah. I mean, one of my one of my friends has like this interesting question, which is like, what do you think is taboo now that like probably won't be taboo in like 30 years? And one of his arguments is like it'll be much more normal for people to be in relationships with non-humans
Yeah.
in 30 years. Uh, and I can totally see it.
Yeah.
Like even just it's been like 1 year, right? And there's already like all sorts of like interesting parasocial dynamics and like yeah, services that are built to kind of abuse this. Um,
As your cat runs around, it's like, yeah, we're basically going to have relationships like cats, with our AIs. So yeah,
yeah,
they will abuse us and we will deal with it.
yeah, yeah. One of the like on the Replit side, like one of the interesting things that I think is actually like a more generalizable thing that relates to kind of like the ChatGPT like politeness like thing is like a lot of the functionality that we want that we like imagine when we're cooking up the tools, like people aren't going to figure out how to do on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ChatGPT is like they have the same kind of challenge. I think even broader because it's so general. Um, and I think like one way to discover what's possible is by treating the tool as if it's like an open-ended conversation
Hmm.
and just seeing where people go naturally. But I think there's other, there's obviously other ways. Like you open up a new tab in ChatGPT, there's like the 4 suggestions
Yeah.
for like what you can do. I think that's like another area that we are going to learn a lot more about, like how to actually get people to understand what you can do with these systems, because until you end up in a world where like everyone's using the same general model that can do anything anywhere, like I think it's actually going to be a huge mental burden to like understand what each thing is capable of, like as you're going about your workday, right?
This brings up a really like a fascinating or like an area that I'm trying to emphasize as part of this class too, which is like I think prompt engineering is a wonderful concept, but it puts so much burden on the user to figure stuff out that it's like this is the problem, right? Is like, well, this tool can do all these crazy things, but if we don't highlight that for you or like help you learn alongside that, then again, it's sort of that like OpenAI wins because everyone has OpenAI cheat sheets, right? Because that's the generalizable one. That's the one that everyone uses. So you Google like, how do I get ChatGPT to do X, Y, and Z for me? And then someone will say like, oh, you've got to like use these 5 catchphrases or whatever it is. And it's like, this is again a place where like if you own your own models or like you are doing your own research into them, like you need to sort of like figure out how to make that apparent to customers. Like I was actually looking at Firefly last night. I haven't played with it since they first launched, and the new interface like has a bunch of like they basically have turned it into a bunch of GUI options, right? Where you can then select different styles. Like they sort of have taken all the prompt engineering and turned that into UI. So you can select different stylistic
Yeah.
components. You can suggest different like areas. And I think like, while not perfect, like that is a good first step into something where it's not just like, here's an open text field, you got to go figure it out yourself. Like, okay, we know things that work within this model, so we will suggest those to you or bring that to the forefront in terms of the UI. And I think like that is again the next year or two will probably be people realizing that that's what needs to happen in order to actually use these models. You can't just put an open text field in there and say, guess what, you're on your own. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of effort being made into trying, whether it's just here's 4 suggestions or whether it's like, we'll actually break these down in components that you can then play with and do UIs with and that sort of thing, or that sort of space. So yeah, it's a big challenge right now. And I think we're just starting to see people starting to crack that open and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. I'm definitely a big fan of like prompt engineering via UI.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it just makes like it's the whole like recognition over recall, but it's like recognition over imagination.
Yeah.
Like, uh, there's something that's so concretely helpful about seeing like 10 choices and like 10 different variable axes that I can like think on. Um, and I think like yeah, there's definitely some like philosophical opposition to that. I think because people are like the whole point of these tools is to like break out of deterministic uh, controls, right, and toggles and switches. But I think that's kind of giving people uh, like almost too much credit.
Yeah. Well, and
Like
also we've had 25 years of deterministic UIs, so people are used to that sort of behavior, right? So it's a little bit of like we might need to slowly progress people out of that, or even, again, I think that's sort of anti-human behavior, right? Like a lot of humans are coming in with 50 other things in their mind, and you have to give them some easy way to get started or step through things. So yeah, it's a big challenge. I think it's definitely one that we'll see different companies do different things with and try to solve in different ways.
yeah, yeah. I mean, even Google, like Google has like 20 years of uh, people have been using Google for 20 plus years, and like the way that people Google and search is just like a weird syntax of
Yeah.
like learned behavior. Um, but that took like 2 decades like
Yeah.
for people to understand, right?
And I think it took cheat sheets, right? It took people saying like, "Oh, here's how this works," like that sort of thing. And again, not all of us have access to crazy influencer networks where we can say like, "Oh, here's how you use this particular tool." So you do need to find some other way to do that. I know we're running a little short on time, but I did want to ask a little bit about like, at Replit, like, how do you work with again, maybe similar to how Creative Lab works? Like, how do people come to you with ideas of like, hey, we want to introduce this AI tool? Is it you lead from the customer point of view? Is it someone says, I've got this tech and we want to build on top of it? Is it a mix of that? Like, how do you guys go about making decisions there?
Yeah, it's really a mix. The the first tool we did was like an experiment in I think 2021 that was it was when GPT-3 I think came out, or like the API for 3 came out. Um, and at that point, like we really didn't know like how good those tools would be for code. And then at that point, it was literally just like, uh, hey, what can we do with this?
Yeah.
Like, what can we experiment with? And we played around with some ideas, and we launched like a an explanation feature, like highlight some code, like get a little button to explain it.
Okay.
Because at that point with 3, the code that you would get out was still not that great.
Yep.
Um, with 3.5, that kind of, and DaVinci, I think that changed a lot. And so the year after that, it was much more like technology driven, um, in the sense that like there were these models that were coming out. We had hired like an AI team. We had a very acute sense of the experience that we wanted to offer. Like we wanted to do autocomplete. Copilot like had autocomplete. We felt confident that like because that's a familiar form factor to programmers, like to the tools that programmers are already using, like that makes sense as the lowest hanging fruit. And so that project was like mostly like an engineering question. It was like, okay, we know we want to do this thing. What kind of models do we need to use? Are we going to train them our own? Are we going to take off the shelf models? Are we going to fine tune? How do we set up like our inference? Um, and then the year after that has been, um, I would say like mostly a mix of like customer feedback and like internal ideation on what we can do with the AI services that we've built. Um, the AI team right now is, um, I think like 5 or 6 engineers and researchers, and their focus is like building the infrastructure that other teams can use to build AI features. And so what that means in practice is like, if an engineer has some spare time, they might just build uh, like a feature using AI. The most recent example, I don't think this is launched yet, is like um, natural language to a shell command.
Mm.
It's like you're in the shell, and you can just like generate a bash command with human syntax. Because has anyone who's played with like bash scripting will tell you it's like if you don't memorize the syntax, you have to Google everything.
Yep.
um, and so it's a mix of like those things, which then kind of like come to design organically, and like maybe they're just good to go, or maybe we have some suggestions on how to make them a little bit more understandable or discoverable. Um, but then there's also like a whole swath of things that like come from just customer feedback. Um, the biggest one that we've discovered is like since we launched the like generalized AI chat, um, people just have like very clear expectations about the context that it has on the project. People are like, why didn't it read this file? And it's like your project is 500 files. Like we can't fit all of that into the prompt that we send to the model. And so that has given us like very clear sets of things to work on, just like seeing where like what people are complaining about with the current experience and like what they wish it could do. Um, yeah, those are, but like, yeah, it's really all over the place. One of the hardest things I think is like with these technologies, especially like you can build everything, like especially a generalized tool for software creation. Like we could take AI and put it everywhere. I think the hardest question for a company with limited time and resources is like, where do you get the most value?
Mm-hmm.
Um, like, is it building like an AI interface for like, SQL syntax or like cron syntax? Is it like code generation? Is it like helping people review other people's code? And we're like kind of just figuring it out as we go. Like
No, I
how
mean, I
that's
think
like.
that's the reality of everyone right now, right? Is like I think, yeah, you could solve the thing with AI. Is it better to solve it with just a general, if else statement, which some chatbots are doing? And then, yeah, what I also love about you is like you're mentioning like taking user feedback and trying to iterate on the next version of it, which I think is another thing that people are struggling with because it's easy to go from 0 to 1 by just like building a tool that works. Getting it working is great, but then it's like getting that feedback and understanding like, hey, it's actually failing in these areas. And sometimes like that's out of your hands, right? You need to retrain the model to actually solve for that or other things. And that can be one of the challenges trying to figure out like, okay, is it a model problem? Is it a interface problem? Is it,
Yeah.
a behavioral problem? Like there's all these issues. And this is again where I think like product designers are really important because they've got experience doing solving in different places like these things. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, one of the other big problem that we've seen is like a marketing problem,
Mm.
or like maybe marketing is the wrong word, but like an expectations problem. Like, and I think a lot of companies are going to run into this. I think we definitely shot ourselves in the foot a little bit. Is like um, we kind of market ourselves publicly. If you go to like our homepage, I think the tagline is like idea to software fast. If you go to the AI page, it's like all about how AI can help you write code. Um, and so I think, and so there have been a lot of people who have like signed up without really knowing how to code and like expected
Mm.
AI
Yep.
to be able to like do everything for them. Um, and so I think that is like a positioning problem that most of these tools are going to have as well. Like if you're kind of focusing on a particular domain, like how the hard question for us is like, okay, yeah, we have these people coming in who like maybe are having unrealistic expectations, but like clearly there's intent there, and clearly there's demand for like some form of service that can help them. And like, do we take that emergent demand and like build tooling specifically for them, right? Or do we kind of ignore them and say like, actually, that's not the market we care about. Like, we're going to focus on this group of programmers and creators instead. And I think that's something like you can kind of get yourself into with marketing and positioning very easily without realizing it. And I think we definitely have experienced that this year.
Yeah, I think that's actually something I'm going to talk about today in today's like class about like how do you position yourselves as an AI company? Is it like it's all magic, which magic is like if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, then we can't explain it to you. Like versus do we sort of stepwise into that, or even call it like a labs function where it's like, hey, it's experimental. It might not work for you, but that's okay. Like we're taking feedback on it. Like I think there's definitely going to need to be a lot of thought that goes into that experience because many of these models, your first experience with them might be bad. And again, you don't want to break trust there by saying like, hey, this will work perfectly for you. Like look at all the demos.
Yeah.
But you do also want to learn and be able to iterate from that behavior and be able to work with. So again, it's about building trust and how you market a thing it involves trust as well.
Yeah. And I think what we're also kind of learning is like it's a lot of that is about sequencing when someone
Mm.
comes into the product. Like I
Yeah.
think you're going to have a very different experience coming into Replit if like you come in and the first thing we show you is, hey, you can write code and you can run it immediately and you can collaborate. And like then, oh, by the way, we have this AI thing. Then like if you come in and the first thing you try is like, give me like a Shopify clone like with AI. And I think, yeah, demonstrating value and like the kind of core capabilities of the platform before getting it into the AI, I think is something we're thinking more about. Yeah, and I think because if someone comes in and they like try your chatbot and it doesn't work, it might be missing the like vast swath of other services that like work perfectly well. Like, yeah,
Yeah. Cool. I want to wrap up just with maybe one other question, which is, again, this is a class for mostly people entering into the field of AI, starting to learn like, as someone who's been involved in the space for a while, like if you were to go back and sort of tell yourself like, oh, do this one thing differently, or, think about this other thing, or like, actually, this was the best thing that could have happened to me. What would you say are sort of advice for people about like getting started?
yeah. It's a good question. I think there's two. One is like for almost every experience that matters, um, get as quickly as possible to a point that you can manipulate the model and the software. instead of kind of like staying in design world or like mock world or speculative world for a long time. Um, I've made that mistake so many times in the past. Like, I'll talk to someone about the new research model and I'll be like, oh, I have this great idea. And then I'll go and like design it out and mock it up. And then we'll like prototype it with the model and it like works totally differently. Like, or like it becomes very obviously clear that like there's some problem or like, the latency is different or like the model output is like just wacky in a way that I didn't account for. And so I think the biggest thing you can do to save yourself time is like kind of just start playing with the thing as soon as you can. Um, like, and don't try to speculate too much about what's possible before you do. Um, and then I think the second thing is like try to keep uh, the like clearly understood user benefit in mind when you are working directly with like the engineers and the researchers. I think the trap that like I've fallen into a lot and that I've seen others fall into is like you become so interested and excited about the technical part that like you as a designer also start to the lose focus on like what actually matters for the customer or the end user. Um, and like at the end of the day, that's kind of your job. Like advocate for helping those people have an experience that they understand and use and delight. And so I think it's just like it's especially this like imposter syndrome, I think, curse for tech designers and technical designers working with engineers is like you kind of, at least this is how I've experienced it. Like I want to kind of like earn respect and trust by like understanding and being a part of technical conversations. But I think I've definitely overdone that in the past and like lost sight of the bigger picture.
I think it's a perfect place to wrap up, which is, you are the designer in the room and you have a designer skill set. And you need to maintain that even when you're working with brand new technology. So, Barron, thank you. This has been a really awesome conversation, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Hope you stay warm.
You as well.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.